But like I said, he had sound military judgment, being a trained West Pointer, to order the charge, and that's what we're going to be focusing on when we cross that open field. Now, we will be following the fence lines as much as possible. Not going to guarantee your shoes aren't going to be covered with mud, but we're going to try to avoid all that as much as possible. Mine, fairly nice. So we stick to those fences, get you back over here, just follow the route back to your cars if you're not parked on the other side. We shall begin with this. After the second day's fighting, Robert E. Lee had some successes down on the left flank of the Federal line with James Longstreet's attacks, and of course the position General Lee wanted to take, which was the right flank of the Federal line, because the right flank of the Federal line over by Culp's Hill, Spangler Spring, and East Cemetery Hill was closer to his true objective, to beat the Federal Army here at Gettysburg, and that was taking out Cemetery Hill. General Lee said in his after-action report that the position I needed to take to beat the Federal Army at Gettysburg, the plans to take that position were laid down the evening of July 1st, and the plan had not changed through the course of the fighting. So he's still concentrating on taking out Cemetery Hill. He figures the right flank is the closer and the best place to take that hill, and so the attacks on July 3rd, the diversionary attack of James Longstreet down to the left, and of course the main attacks over by Richard Ewell on the right, did not provide the satisfactory outcome that General Lee wanted, to take out Cemetery Hill. So he makes a plan on July 2nd or July 3rd to take the hill. He's going to revisit the right flank of the Federal line. He discusses those events with Richard Ewell. Richard Ewell is to not demonstrate, go in at a dawn, full-blown attack against the Union right flank. Well, Richard Ewell undoubtedly said, that's what I did yesterday, and I had some successes, but I couldn't turn that Union right flank and take out Cemetery Hill. General Lee assures Richard Ewell of a couple things. First of all, he said all the Federal troops are up into the fishhook, the famous fishhook-shaped battle line. There's no lingering down to the south along the Baltimore Pike. They're all 7 corps are up in the line. A lot of them, Federal troops, are on the far left, down by the Round Tops. I have General Longstreet's whole corps down there that fought on July 2nd, now under the command of a trusted brigade commander, Evander Law. Those men, he said, are holding the Union left in place. And if Evander Law has an order that if you see any appreciable loss of Union troops off your front, you are to come rolling in on a full-blown attack. So he's got the Union left held down. Then he moves to the center with Richard Ewell. Along the Union center, and the Union center is roughly from the Cadore Farm here, you can see, or Pennsylvania Monument, north up to where you can see the buildings over here, right over there, those modern buildings. There's a few less Federal troops along the center, but he figures there's about 7,500 or so. Federal infantry backing up about 80 Federal cannon. So he has General George Pickett's division of about 7,000 men. He's going to bring in another 7,000 under the commands of Generals Pettigrew and Trimble, where we're located. And those roughly 14,000 men are holding down the Union center, with orders that if they see any appreciable loss of Union troops off their front, that they'll come rolling in. So he proposes to Richard Ewell, if all the Federal troops are up in battle, up in the fishhook, and I've got the left and the center hold down, where's General Meade of the Federal Army going to get the troops to send against you? Well, with no reinforcements, he's going to have to deal with the 12th Corps and a handful of 11th Corps men. Richard Ewell says, well, if the reinforcements aren't rushed in and you've got the left and the center held down, and I just got to contend with the men that I've contended with for 2 days, I can carry the works. So Richard Ewell starts to plan his full-blown attack in the early morning hours, and the Federal Army does something that kind of they do that all the time on the right flank. They counterattack just before dawn, so Richard Ewell has to fight on the defense. Finally, he rights the ship and comes in around 8:30, 9 o'clock on his full-blown attacks against the Union right flank to take out Cemetery Hill and win General Lee a great victory. By about 11:30 in the morning, Richard Ewell informs General Lee of a couple things. First of all, that he's no closer to turning the Union right flank than he was the day before, and that his men were taking 6th Corps Federal prisoners. The 6th Corps under John Sedgwick is the reserve corps of the Army of the Potomac. There happened to be also the largest corps in the Army of the Potomac with nearly 15,000 men. Just a few brigades came up the Baltimore Pike the afternoon of July 2nd. Those men of the 6th Corps, General Meade had to send to bolster up and stop the bleeding on his left flank from James Longstreet's attack. Most of the Reserve Corps came up the late in the evening of July 2nd into the early morning hours of July 3rd. And where do you suppose General Meade's going to send them? Right to his right flank. He's got a lot of men along the left and men in the center, and that's why Richard Ewell was telling General Lee he was picking up Federal prisoners from the 6th Corps. Well, General Lee, probably around 11:30 or close to noon, straight up noon, is not going to revisit the Union right flank. He's been trying to turn that flank for 2.5 days, and he's not going to revisit and dip his toes in that well again. So, standing up here along Seminary Ridge, Robert E. Lee knows that his time is limited up here in the north. He knows that he cannot pack up and go home. He's got to beat the Federal Army here at Gettysburg. He will never get the permission from Samuel Cooper, Chief of Staff, and Jefferson Davis in Richmond to ever invade the North again. This is a one-time shot at it. He won't have the opportunity, he won't have the men and materiel or the permission to take the war to the enemy. And unless he beats the Federal Army right here at Gettysburg, he knows the war will revert back into Virginia. It will become a war of attrition that the South will not win. The Federal troops have all the advantage in numbers and men and materiel. So that's why he's very offensive-minded here at Gettysburg. You know, a lot of you saw the movie and he kept on saying, I have no time, I've got to get this done, I got no time. He'll never get permission to ever do this again. And that's why Gettysburg is the turning point for General Lee's army. He's got to beat the Federal Army because the war will revert back into Virginia and be a war of attrition if he doesn't. So he's thinking about another plan. So near these locations out here along Seminary Ridge, Robert E. Lee is looking over at that Union Center, looking down to the left, looking behind him to the men that have been decoying the Union Center and left. He could revisit General Longstreet's attacks way down on the left flank of the Federal line by the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, Little Round Top. but there's a lot of massive Union troops down there. And of course, they hold little round tops so they can see Confederate troop movements for miles around. So the far left is out. So General Lee takes a closer look at the Union center of the line. The Union center, like I pointed out, roughly from the big white Pennsylvania monument, just past the white farm buildings of the Bryan farm. With his staff, he's starting to look, and he's finding, once again, that there are very few Union troops comparably to the right and the left along the center. He also counts nearly about 80 Federal artillery pieces and roughly about 75 to 8,000 infantry along the center. And then he looks behind him to the commands of General Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble, the men who've been decoying the Union center for Richard Ewell's attacks, numbering close to about 14,000. And then he envisions a plan. Why don't I use those men directed against the Union center? But that would be a direct frontal assault across nearly a mile of open ground to break through that Union center, turn left in layman's terms, and at about 400 yards you can take out Cemetery Hill from the reverse, from the interior lines of the Federal Army. But it would be a direct frontal assault against the Federal positions. But General Lee, as a cadet at West Point, like all these West Pointers, learned all about direct frontal assaults against or against their opponent's battle lines. West Point taught these young cadets that a direct frontal assault against your opponent's defensive line is a military option you have as a commander. But they also warned these young cadets that if you exercise that option called a direct frontal assault against your opponent's defensive line, they can and do work, but they're always costly in men and materiel. And West Point said they are big gambles because they're very costly, but they can and do work, especially if you adhere to a series of 6 principles that West Point taught their young cadets when it came to frontal assaults. If you apply these 6 principles, you can lessen the gamble. It's still going to be a gamble, but you'll lessen the gamble. Give your frontal assault a better chance of success. So undoubtedly, these 6 principles General Lee learned at West Point, and of course on other frontal assaults that he had made in the past, is determined that if those 6 principles hold, those men of Generals Pettigrew, Trimble, and George Pickett, those 14,000 men, will break through that Federal line and win him a great victory by taking out Cemetery Hill. General Lee then does something unusual. He summons over a trusted subordinate that'd been fighting and had some successes on his diversionary attack on the Union left flank the day before, General James Longstreet. James Longstreet is asked what his opinion about this frontal assault is, and he repeats to General Lee, and I quote, "Sir, I've been a commander of troops all my life. I have led companies of men in combat. I have led regiments. I have led brigades and divisions. And now as a corps commander in your army, I'm telling you respectively, sir, no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position. But General Lee disagrees, thinking of those 6 principles. So General Lee points to a little clump of tree. Like I said, if you follow this nice wrought iron fence line down over on the federal line, you can see with the fence around it. How many people been over there to the angle of the stone wall with the open book monument listing all the men of the Confederacy that came across this field? Points to that little clump of trees, turns to General Longstreet. That is where the enemy is, and that's where we're going to attack. And then he places General Longstreet logistically in charge of carrying out this frontal assault. Now, General Longstreet's a trained West Pointer, so he has to think back quickly to his West Point days and think of those 6 principles that will give this frontal assault a better chance of success. And we will, while we're right here, we'll run down those 6 things that General Longstreet now has to think about. And then when we head across the field, we'll apply them in Longstreet's assault. Or we'll talk about them, each one of them, as in real time as we go across. General Longstreet thinks back to the first principle. The first principle taught by these at West Point said that you have to pick a point of attack on your opponent's defensive line. His defensive line cannot be strong everywhere, and it doesn't go on into infinity. It does come to an end. You're to probe and you're to find a weaker spot than the rest of the spots along his defensive line and concentrate your frontal assault at that perceived weak spot. That's called the point of attack. Well, that's an easy one for General Longstreet. General Lee told him where the point of attack was. The Union Center. There's where the enemy is, and that's where we're going to attack. So, with that in the bag, he turns to the second principle. West Point taught these young cadets that frontal assaults can and do work, but they're big gambles for you to make because they're very costly in men and materiel. The first few waves against a stone wall here at Gettysburg, or maybe a beach in Normandy, you can expect casualty rates up to the first 7-8 waves of at least 70 to 75% of your men. They're very costly. So, West Point taught these young cadets like James Longstreet that you must have, this is in General Longstreet's days, it's improved since then, that you must have at least a 2-to-1 advantage of troops over your opponent at the point of attack. So that's when General Longstreet calls in his staff, and they're looking over, counting, get a rough estimate, and they come up with about 80 federal guns, like General Lee thought, and about 7,500 or so federal infantry backing up those 80 guns along the Union Center. So, if he needs a 2-to-1 advantage of troops, how many men, say if there's 7,000 or so over across at the Union Center, how many men must he send at a 2-to-1 advantage against that Union Center? About 14,000. He has those men in Generals Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble over here on the left. So he has that in the bag. He's got a 2-to-1 advantage. He's got the point of attack. So he turns to the third principle. You have to neutralize your opponent's artillery and air cover at the point of attack. Well, General Longstreet doesn't have to neutralize any Federal aircraft, but he does have to neutralize his opponent's artillery at the point of attack. That's when he calls in his trusted artillery chief, battalion chief, Edward Porter Alexander. He calls Alexander over and he says, how many artillery pieces will you need and how long it will take for you to neutralize those roughly 80 Federal guns at the point of attack? E.P. Alexander, who always does things right, he said, you give me 150 Confederate artillery pieces on a mile-long front along Seminary Ridge, and if it's done properly, and believe me, it will be done properly according to E.P. Alexander, 1/2 an hour it will take us to neutralize roughly those 80 Federal guns at the point of attack. Well, 150 guns firing from these positions over there, you know, look at, you're eyeballing it, everything's line of sight back in those days. It's even, right? The ground is even. Oh man, 150 artillery pieces aimed right there will neutralize those 80 guns in 1/2 an hour. So, coming from his trusted subordinate, E.P. Alexander, he's got the third principle. Then he turns to the fourth. You have to provide artillery and air support for your men going in on that point of attack. Well, he doesn't have any aircraft to worry about, but he does have to provide artillery support. So he turns to Alexander and says, how many of those guns, those 150 if you can get them, will have enough long-range shot and shell left after that half-hour bombardment to go forward on predetermined platforms and protect my infantry all the way in on the point of attack? E.P. Alexander, according to men on General Longstreet's staff, then puts it back on James Longstreet. According to the eyewitnesses, E.P. Alexander said, how many Confederate artillery pieces support a corps in our army? Longstreet said, I had about 60 guns yesterday on my attacks over on the Union left flank. I said, that's about right. You have about 14,000 men. That's roughly a corps in our army. So you will have at least 60 artillery pieces that have enough long-range shot and shell after we neutralize the Federals that will be moved forward with your infantry on predetermined artillery platforms to protect those men all the way in. So he's got the fourth principle. Guarantees by his artillery chief, Edward Porter Alexander, that's never let James Longstreet down. So he turns to the fifth principle. That is, you have to protect your flanks. When you are starting out on a broad mile front and you have to get into the point of attack along the Federal line, it's about 1/4 mile. So you're going from a wide front down to a small point of attack. When you move forward, your flanks could be exposed. Quite likely, the ends of your battle line. The far left, where we are down here, and the far right, where General Pickett is. And if your flanks are exposed, there's nothing to stop your opponent from moving out of their line. Turn your flanks of your frontal assault, roll it up like a carpet and smash it like a paper sack. So the fifth principle is you have to protect those ends of the line. You have to protect the flanks. General Longstreet has a great man in John Brockenborough and his brigade. John Brockenborough has been supporting the flanks of General Lee's army, and he's one of the best. He's got almost this intuition that when you go in protecting a flank, he's got eyes all over. He's able to prejudge what the Union Army's going to do. He's got this unique ability to protect a flank. What better man than to put on the left flank? Right over here, right back over here. About 1,600 to 2,000 men of John Brockenborough, whose job it is to protect to protect Pettigrew and Trimble's men all the way along this fence line. All the way in. But then he starts to think, he's got that left covered. John Brockenborough is one of the best. But what is he going to do on the far right? There, or over here, you have a little less than a mile to protect. Over here, it's a big, broader porch. You've got like 1.25 miles or more down on the far right of General Pickett down there. So he's going to need somebody down there on the right flank. So he's thinking, who can I send to protect Pickett's division down on the far right flank? James Kemper's brigade's going to be down there. And then he has an idea. He's going to choose a brigade commander out of his first corps that he's very familiar with. Not the superlative flank protector as John Brockenborough, but a real good commander. Follows orders and does excellent work. He almost broke through the Federal line on July 2nd, part of the attacks against the Union left flank the day before, and that's a commander, general by the name of Cadmus Wilcox. Wilcox, his brigade was kind of beat up, kind of chewed up on that second day, almost breaking through the Federal line. So General Longstreet is going to give him some support to help with his brigade. Part of the attacks on July 2nd, the Florida Brigade went in there. That's David Lang's Florida Brigade. The Florida Brigade, they're not as badly beat up, so why don't I combine those two, Cadmus Wilcox Brigade along with David Lang's Floridians? They would be a perfect answer to protect James Kemper in Pickett's division on the far right. So, with Wilcox and Lang, and down here, John Brockenborough, he believes he has that 5th principle in the bag, so he turns to the 6th principle. Frontal assaults are taught in those West Point classrooms. They're big gambles. They're costly in men and materiel. First few waves, 70% or more casualties. The key for most frontal assaults is not the men that initially go in, it's the reserves that you have to send in Johnny on the spot to take advantage of any kind of breakthrough. You have to logistically provide for reinforcements. General Longstreet's looking around and he chooses 2 men, Generals Mahone and Posey. Those 2 brigades, some historians say he had 3 or 4, but most historians agree with those 2 brigades that will stand up here on Seminary Ridge, wait for orders to advance to support Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble. They will break through on the backs of the casualties hitting that stone wall. Reserves will come in, they'll break through right near that point of trees, and then they will turn left, and in 400 yards, those reserves, along with any other breakthroughs along the Union Center, will take out Cemetery Hill and win General Lee a great victory. We know from his actions and the reports of the day, General Longstreet was thinking about those 6 principles like a good trained West Pointer. And he believes he's got all those covered. So now his optimism is coming back a little bit. Remember, no 15,000 men arrayed for that battle. So now he's maybe a little more enthused because now he knows he's got those 6 principles in the bag. Late in the early evening, I would say, on July 2nd, these men of Pettigrew and Trimble and Pickett are starting to form up their line. They're given orders that they're going to be decoying the Union center for Richard Ewell's dawn attacks over on the Union right. And they're spotted by the Federal Army massing up in the evening of July 2nd, mass coming over here along Seminary Ridge. So, of course, as they come up, they're going to throw out some skirmishers, and some skirmishers actually get into a barn, the Bliss Farm. You're probably familiar with it. We're going to pass that along the way. And, of course, the 12th New Jersey set forward to get rid of those Confederates in the barn because they're close to the Federal line, they're taking pot shots, and protecting the skirmish line is actually protecting these men of Pettigrew and Trimble that are forming up here. And New Jersey ends up setting the barn on fire, smoke them out. So that barn is going to stay smoking all July 3rd. That's going to add to a little more of the confusion. Imagine a smoking barn right in our front here if you're Pettigrew and Trimble, so that smoke is kind of covering the battlefield. Difficult for the artillery to see the Federal line when they neutralize them, but that's going on. Another thing that went on, and that we'll talk about as we go across the field, is that Pettigrew and Trimble's men have been spotted over here forming up, coming onto the Seminary Ridge. And the Federal Army over there around the Soldiers' Cemetery, Cemetery Hill, they sent William Sawyer's 8th Ohio, about roughly around 300 to 400 men, to see what they're up to, and if you're able to, dislodge the Confederates. So, if you look right over here in these open fields beyond these tree lines, the 8th Ohio, around dark, few half hour or so before dark, they make their way out of the Federal line and they come up and they are spotted by Pettigrew and Trimble's men forming up to be decoying the Union center, and there's a firefight. And sure enough, some of those men were surprised, Pettigrew's men were surprised, and they moved quickly forward. Skirmishers were sent forward, and so William Sawyer's 8th Ohio dispensed them, sent them away. And now it's dark. And so Sawyer decided, rather than, and you look through these open fields over there, rather than approach the Union line at night and be mistaken for Confederates, he decides to order his men into a little woodlot over here and camp out for the night. We'll go in at first light so they can recognize us. I don't want to put our regiment in danger by coming up through the pickets, and because he knows that's a powerful force, especially over there on Cemetery Hill. So he orders his men, no fires, silent, just hunker down for the night. First thing in the morning, we will go into the Federal line. That means cross some open fields to get there. He was certainly surprised in the morning when he saw this mass of Pettigrew, Trimble, and Pickett all massed up here on the ridge. He was very reluctant to go into the Federal line because he would be spotted, and he was afraid that this big force might be set against him. So he told his men to hunker down. We're going to wait for an opportune time when we can get back over to the Federal line. All through the morning, he saw more and more troops arriving up here, Confederate troops up on the ridge. And so he stayed in his position. He also mentioned the Bliss Barn was blowing smoke all over the battlefield, but he stayed in his position. And he stayed there until the afternoon and saw these Confederates coming across these fields on this frontal assault. And we'll talk about a little bit about the 8th Ohio and William Sawyer. So just make mention of him, that he's out here not willing to go back because he sees this Confederate artillery, he would endanger his whole regiment now. So now, since we got the 6 principles out of the way, let's apply them. So let's move on down the line, start to head across the road there. For those of you that we'll see on the other side, right there at the angle. One thing I always like to say, when you get off the auto tour and kind of walk out, you get to see things that you never really get to see unless you get out of your car. Now you can see those artillery positions are right along Seminary Ridge. Nice artillery platform. It stretches for about a mile, these guns. And then you can even see Cemetery Ridge, where the Confederates are attacking, the point of attack from the Pennsylvania Monument over here to your right, all the way up just to the left of the Bryan Farm, that quarter mile. As Pickett and Pettigrew's men are forming up, they're going to be laid down in these little divots, little hollers along Seminary Ridge. Behind the ridge here, the artillery is going to come up on the ridge here, and at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on July 3rd, 1863, a signal gun, actually 2 signal guns, go off in the peach orchard that the Confederates took from Daniel Sickles the day before, signaling 138 Confederate artillery pieces. Ideally, E.P. Alexander told James Longstreet, give me 150, but he did mass 138. That's a lot of artillery pieces. Signals those 138 artillery pieces on this wide, mile-long part of the ridge to open fire at the point of attack. Almost immediately, the Federal artillery, which Henry Hunt has not 80, but 90 Federal guns, so 10 more. But what's 10 guns when you've got 80 that were counted by James Longstreet and E.P. Alexander? You kind of split hairs there, another 10 guns. Those 90 Federal guns at the point of attack fire back. And soon, this half-hour bombardment designed to neutralize his opponent's artillery turns into the longest, no doubt the loudest, artillery duel ever heard on the North American continent. For nearly 2 hours, Confederate artillery on this big, wide, long front of about a mile, firing at the Union guns, the Federal guns, along the point of attack, and a few from the National Cemetery, Cemetery Hill. And for 2 hours, things explode. Men are scattered. And for 2 hours, the Confederate gunners, most of them along this long line of artillery, overshot their mark. Most of the shot and shell fired by these 138 Confederate artillery pieces sailed over the Federal line of artillery up on Cemetery Ridge, landing harmlessly back by the Peter Fry farm along the Taneytown Road, landing on top General Meade's headquarters. A colleague of mine a few years ago said, "I have visited the archives many a time, and I have found a little tidbit of information that no other historian has ever found. For years, and it continues to this day, until I present my facts, no one really had any clear idea where General George Meade of the Federal Army was." And he said, the information I gleaned from the National Archives said that General Meade that afternoon was riding up and down the Federal line. He was not at his headquarters. And I told my colleague, "Good work. But you know what? If my headquarters was being bombarded, I wouldn't have been there either." But the point is, the Confederates, most of these, the shot and shell sailed over the Federal line. Because when you walk the ground like we are, remember, everything was line of sight back then. When you are standing here and you're looking at these beautiful artillery platforms along Cemetery Ridge, they look about even to the point of attack along Cemetery Ridge. But actually, this is a real misconception. The ground is much different around the two ridges. At the point of attack, that quarter mile, that ground is about, on Cemetery Ridge, where the Federal guns are, is 75 feet above sea level over the guns on this mile-long front on Seminary Ridge. So what we believed happened is the Confederates firing here against the Federal guns. Their first shots they fired because they thought it was even. You eyeball with the human sight like we did, it looks even. But they actually fired and fell short. They saw some of those shells explode short, so they took the elevating screw on the gun, elevated a little too much, and it doesn't take much with that screw, and spent the rest of the time trying to knock out those Federal guns, but overshot their mark. Consequently, the Federal guns reported they did the same thing, because they're up higher. They think it's even. Their shells sailed over the Confederate artillery, but they didn't land harmlessly on a road. They landed among the troops that are laying back behind the artillery. Both Pettigrew Trimble's commands and, of course, General Pickett's command, men endured laying in an open field, the infantry, and shot and shell exploding in their ranks. There are many instances of whole companies being lost because they got hit by that overshooting of the Federal guns. So the Confederates artillery, when they overshoot, they land harmlessly on the Taneytown Road by the Peter Fry farm or on top of General Meade's headquarters. It did kill one man from his staff, but hardly any loss of life, and they did not neutralize those Federal guns. Spent almost 2 hours, because as long as those Federal guns are still up and running, your job is to neutralize them. That third principle. And finally, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, maybe a few minutes before, General Henry Hunt for the Federal Army orders his men, orders his artillery to come away from the ridge, come way up, from the stone walls along the ridge, and puts his artillery back. because he's going to force the hand of the Confederates. He sees the infantry. He knows what's coming. So he wants to maybe goad them into attacking. So he pulls his artillery back, tells them to get up the artillery reserve, bring up more ammunition, and things go silent. E.P. Alexander rides up to General Longstreet. Now things are silent. There's very sporadic artillery fire. Figuring that finally, after a couple hours, his guns have done the trick. He comes up to General Longstreet and says, I don't know, General, I'd get those men across that open field as quick as you can, because, you know, we've got just a window for me to support your infantry, so get them across. That's when General Pickett and his staff come up. General Pickett knows that it's the infantry's turn. There's some representatives from Generals Pettigrew and Trimble's men that also come up. And General Pickett addresses General Longstreet. As a subordinate to a superior, I shall lead my division forward, sir. Gets no response. Again, General Pickett, Pettigrew's representatives, and representatives of Isaac Trimble's. Pickett says, I shall lead my division forward, sir. Gets no response. Then, almost like a superior to a subordinate, looks at General Longstreet, I will lead my division forward, sir. Starts to leave with Pettigrew and Trimble's representatives, and General Longstreet gets the nod. General Pickett briefs his division command, his brigade commanders, Generals Pettigrew and Trimble. They brief their men, and each, from the brigade commanders down to the regimental commanders, down to the company commanders, they brief their men. Most of the speeches were kind of fanciful. I know one said, now remember your families, remember your farms, and remember your old Virginians. Probably someone in Pickett's division over there. Over the hill lies Virginian home. Equal representatives of Pettigrew and Trimble. These men are being briefed. We don't have what company commander of Company A, the 26th North Carolina, we don't have his speech. But a lot of the speeches on the company grade were a little bit different than the generals giving the speeches. The 28th Virginian, Pickett's division, was representative of most of what these company commanders did. Company C of the 28th was led by Michael Spessard. And Michael Spessard, when it was his turn to address his 47 men of Company C, it was typical of company commanders. These are the closest to the men. Michael Spessard says to his men, I have no fancy speeches to make to you today. All I'm telling you to do is stay together, help each other out, and I'll see you safely over here after the fight. That was typical of company grade officers and their NCOs. That's the backbone of an army, and these men are giving short speeches, telling the men to stay together. We're going to help each other out. Vastly different than those speeches made by those brigade commanders or maybe those infantry colonels of a regiment. And up they come. Who's leading this is Marshall's brigade of Pettigrew's command, now led by a colonel by the name of Fry. Colonel Fry is going to be coming straight across the field. He is going to be just about where this end of this line is. You see where the ground starts getting higher over here? He's on the far, far right of Pettigrew and Trimble. Just about 500-600 yards away is General Pickett. Colonel Fry is to take his men straight down the middle, and everyone is to guide on him. So the command was given by these divisions, whether you're Pettigrew or Trimble or George Pickett, was guide center, forward march. That repeated it over and over, guide center. So you look at Colonel Fry leading Marshall's brigade across down the center, you're to guide on him. So when you go from a wide front and you're guiding on the center, you just do a series of obliques. If you're far out to the flanks, those are not good enough to turn. So those wide, the men on the far ends of the line, over by Brockenborough and over by Wilcox and Lang, they're going to have to wheel. It's kind of, what's that, centrifugal force or something? A little turn in the middle means a big turn outside on the outside. But keep that in mind. It was Pettigrew and Trimble's men, Colonel Fry and the brigade of Marshall, that they were guiding on. Guide center, forward march. Right up the middle. And all of the command moved out in silence. And people said, well, that's surprises me. You know, 26 North Carolina was right about here, and they were moved out in silence. Yeah, I'd say, well, you know, Southerners, just like their northern counterparts, are American soldiers. American soldiers are silent soldiers. We're not the British playing bagpipes going into battle. We aren't Germans singing patriotic songs. American soldiers are silent soldiers. That is deadly soldiers. They're concentrating on the mission ahead. And that's what makes American, in my belief, American soldiers and men of the American military a deadly force, because we were focused on the mission at hand. And they walked out in perfect silence. Most of the men commented, by now we are professional. General Lee believes he has the finest light infantry in the world, and as they came down from the ridge here and entered this area in total silence, no federal artillery going on, and they look to their left as far as to their right as far as you can see. There's more Pettigrew and Trimble, more Pickett, and your confidence, of course, is coming back really quick. And they came out in steady step, superb alignment, right down from the ridge. Let's go down. Let's guide center. So, that third principle, the Confederates failed to neutralize their opponent's artillery. The third principle, taught in the West Point classroom, definitely had an impact for Longstreet's assault. And as the infantry went forward, they come to, if you look across, Pickett's over here, majority of Pettigrew and Trimble. You see the Virginia Monument. See there's a little fence line roughly where Fry was at. And then, of course, over here with Pettigrew and Trimble. General Pickett noticed it first. As he led his men up to this part of the ridge, actually, Seminary Ridge is a series of a couple of ridges that cut through here. And he led his men up on the ridge, and they started to experience federal artillery fire again when they come up to this spot. Now, Pickett has a little bit of advantage because the ridge is a little more pronounced. There's a little more of a saddle to it. So his men could go down into the saddle, disappear, come back up on the ridge, and that's what they did when they got hit by artillery. Not so Pettigrew and Trimble. Look at the front. Those artillery pieces are in your face the whole way across. They opened fire about right here. And immediately General Pickett noticed it first. Where are those Confederate guns that were promised to support the fourth principle? You have to support this infantry assault with artillery or air cover that we don't have to mention. Well, to make a long story short, because most of those Confederate guns were out of long-range shot and shell, because the bombardment would lasted 2 hours rather than a half an hour. Most of them didn't have enough long-range shot and shell to support Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble. Over here, General Pickett counts about 7 artillery pieces, mainly up by the Gettysburg Road. There he goes, one of them. It was even worse over on this side. To support Pettigrew and Trimble, they didn't have many good artillery platforms over here, but they counted about 9. A total of somewhere between 16 to 20 artillery pieces to support nearly 14,000 men. Raise your hand if you would feel comfortable, if you're General Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble, knowing you have a whopping 16 to 20 guns to support 14,000 men. Yeah, nobody usually raises their hand on that one. Failure to provide adequate artillery support for this frontal assault doomed this frontal assault, along with not neutralizing your opponent's artillery, then not enough artillery support, but you still have that 5th principle, protecting the flanks. And we will start with General Pickett. As General Pickett's far, far right under James Kemper wheeled to get into, they have a big wheel across the Emmitsburg Road to get up towards those tree line, the trees right there, the point of attack. Cadamus Wilcox was experiencing trouble supporting Kemper on Kemper's left flank. And I will let Cadamus Wilcox say, when we crossed the Emmitsburg Road, we were right on his flank, right on Kemper's flank, supporting him all the way in, when all of a sudden the big guns from Little Round Top opened fire. And from that point, from the Emmitsburg Road on, every step I took forward to support James Kemper, I was knocked 3 steps back by the guns of the Federal Army. You don't neutralize your opponent's artillery, you're going to use it on your flanks, and they did that. Kemper kept rolling right in, wheeling around. The Federal Army under Hancock, General Hancock, ordered the Vermont Brigade to move perpendicular out of the line and cut Kemper to pieces. Forced Kemper from the right of the Kadori farm into the left. So they gave up a lot of valuable ground on the point of attack. It's a 1/4 mile point of attack. Now they're pushed in. So the point of attack is getting less and less. That means you don't maneuver as much when you're being accordioned in. And then right around this spot, right near where the Bliss farm was, and it's smoldering, blowing smoke around the battlefield, John Brockenborough, right over here, just beyond this fence line. He is right on the far left of Pettigrew and Trimble. He is supporting them when William Sawyer of the 8th Ohio, that were right up here in this woodlot, he said later, I ordered my men down. The colors were furled, and I had them lay down. And when Brockenborough came up to this spot, focused on the Bryan farm and the smoke blowing this way from the Bliss farm on fire or smoldering, Sawyer ordered his roughly 300 to 400 infantry to get on their feet, form in 2 ranks, and they delivered a volley right at point blank into John Brockenborough. John Brockenborough quickly wheeled his men to get over out of that fire, and when he wheeled them, they fired into the backs of them. It was just horrible for John Brockenborough. And once he's taken such intense fire, and of course the artillery now is seen and continuing their work, the Federal artillery at the point of attack, and including some guns from Cemetery Hill, John Brockenborough did something that he never did before and will never do again for the rest of the war. He ordered his men to quit the flank. Ordered these men to quickly form and get back up to the safety of the artillery up here on Seminary Ridge. He quit the flank. Said in an after-action report, I was getting hit in all my left flank and my right flank from a superior force of Union infantry and artillery. 300 to 400 infantry of Sawyer. Sawyer's men, who had camped out that night, didn't want to make a move when they saw the big forming up of the Confederate Army, knowing that the Confederate artillery might just put his whole regiment in jeopardy. They were probably stayed put because they would have been under tremendous fire. But just luckily, he had his men, he had them lay down, and they just waited, and for an opportune time, and sent Brockenborough reeling. When that happens, and Brockenborough quits and starts heading out, forming up and heading back up the ridge, left Pettigrew and Trimble's men over here with no flank support, and the Federal Army sees an advantage. With the 8th Ohio right up there, then the artillery. A few more units, like the 11th Massachusetts, were sent out of the line and basically pushed Pettigrew and Trimble's men from this area into, see that evergreen pine tree right over this rail, or excuse me, right over this post. So both flanks were pushed in. You're supposed to be hitting a quarter-mile point of attack. Now the point of attack has been reduced into a matter of yards when the flanks support is demolished. They're like an accordion. These men are moved closer. Now people say, well, that's no problem. They'll just have a bigger mass of men hitting a smaller point of attack. No, you can't maneuver. How do you maneuver when you have men coming behind you? They're right in front of you, and they're being squeezed into a smaller area. It's like if you put 100 goldfish in a bowl. They're not going to be swimming around much, are they? They're going to be just sitting there in a big blob. You can't maneuver. There's no left wheels, no right wheels. There's no left obliques. There's no right obliques. The only thing you do is slowly go deeper into close to the Federal line. I always like to say, when they hit this spot here and the flanks collapsed and the Union Army went perpendicular out into these open fields by the Emmitsburg Road, General Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble's men were marching into an open-ended box. Union infantry and artillery on the sides, infantry and artillery up the middle. The safest part in an open-ended box is usually back out the back. But if you do that, that's no option, because you're going to put a big target on your back that says, shoot me. Especially on a frontal assault, you keep going deeper to close with the enemy. If you go back through the open end of the box, you are going to be a casualty. Something unique with frontal assaults. The men that go forward, you have a better chance of success on a frontal assault, or survival, I guess the best way to put it, than if you turn and go back. General Cotta said it best at that frontal assault against the beaches of Normandy. When his men were stymied there on Omaha Beach, he came up and told his men, there's two type of men on this beach, those that are dead and those that are going to be. So get up and move forward against the enemy. Go deeper against them, like into this open-ended box here at Gettysburg. And of course, after a bloody, long day there, those men were successful. I don't know what it is, but the only chance you have to survive, forget about victory, is to just go deeper and deeper into that box and survive. Failure to neutralize their opponent's artillery doomed this frontal assault. Failure to provide artillery support for this frontal assault doomed Longstreet's attempt at breaking through the federal line on July 3rd. And when the collapsed flanks, due to the fact that the Federal Army moved forward and they're going to use their artillery on the flanks, doomed this frontal assault. And they even were accorded in, so they even lost that valuable ground to maneuver. So they even lost basically the point of attack. But they do have a couple left. By the time they reach the Emmitsburg Road, and we're going to reach that in a minute, I'll let you know what happens then, but they even lost their 2-to-1 advantage of troops. General Meade was very good at moving some troops from the south, about 3,000 troops into the Union Center without Evander Law knowing about it, and combined with the casualties along the Emmitsburg Road, that killing zone, they even lost their 2-to-1 advantage at the point of attack. But they do have one left, and we'll be talking about that farther up. So let's get through. There's the evergreen pine tree. Most of Pettigrew and Trimble's men were pushed from out there to the right of the pine tree. A handful of units, like the 11 Mississippi, they did get among the Bryan farm, but that was after the collapse of the flanks. Most of them were just pushed up. They crossed they got to the Emmitsburg Road, and about 100 yards on either side of the road, as we'll walk up there, is the killing zone. Most battlefields have a killing zone where large men are going to die, and the Federal Army basically targeted the Emmitsburg Road. That's about 400 yards out, and that's going to be reserved for artillery, anti-personnel ordnance, their canister, and infantry fire. And your job as an infantry officer, a company grade officer, is to get your men through the killing zone as quick as possible. But there's a problem. When you neared the Emmitsburg Road, you ended up hitting these post and rail fences. These were put in on major avenues coming into this market town of Gettysburg by the farmers to keep animals that are coming up these major routes into town out of their farm fields. And the farmers put these post and rails up because they're sturdier than any other fences out there. And to sturdy them up even more, every other post, these farmers took 5 big spikes and nailed the rails into the post. For example, we would nail this rail, this rail, this rail, this rail, and this rail, skip that post, and then do it again at the next one. They were impossible to tear down. And can't go over, can't go under them, can't go through them, so soldiers, some of them had to go over them. This slowed your company grade, those company grade officers slowed their companies down to a crawl. So they're going to spend more time than they wanted inside the killing zone. Now, whether these fences were taken into mind by the Federals over on their side, we don't know. All we do know, it slowed Pickett, Pettigrew, Trimble's men down to a crawl when the spot they needed to speed up quicker, but they were slowed down inside this killing zone. It's going to force a lot of men to be casualties. But luckily, the farmers, when they put up these post and rail fences, they did every so often have a cattle gate where their cattle could come in and graze. Cattle gates were very small, about 2 men could get through them at one time, not like the big openings that we're going to cross, but that still is going to funnel just a couple minutes at a time. So these fences certainly played a role by slowing the Confederates down, the infantry attack down to almost a standstill right here in the killing zone. But a number of men did make it through those cattle gates, and they formed up on the other side. So we're going to find one of those little cattle gates, break, cross the Gettysburg Road safely. Casualties that were here in 1863, we don't want to add to those. So let's, Tom, the point of attack is now reduced from just basically this side of the very orchard right there to just this side of that evergreen pine tree. So they were caught in the killing zone, slowed down in the killing zone. Finally, they got across deeper into that box. There's the federal line center right there. And they've lost so much ground in the killing zone. They were supposed to hit it from the Pennsylvania Monument up to the left of the Bryan Farm. But now they're so condensed. The only thing they could do is just keep going forward. There are instances where the men were saying that all we did, because we were so crowded in, one soldier said, I lowered my cap and rested my hand on the shoulder or on the back of the man in front of me and just kept moving. You lose all type of maneuverability when you do that. But they managed to get across the road. Soldiers said that the infantry along the center there was pouring volley after volley. One soldier said the mini balls hitting the fence, they were hit at such a high rate it sounded like rain on a tin roof. One soldier said I could lift my cap in the air, catch a whole cap full of mini balls. Henry Hunt, just about the time when they crossed the Emmitsburg Road, just as they're getting out of the killing zone, he ordered his artillery to pull back again, send the infantry up. Almost universally, all the guns along the center followed his order, except one battery. That's Battery A of the 4th U.S. under its young Lieutenant Alonzo Cushing, who had a battery of 6 3-inch ordnance rifles right there at the point of trees, from that tree right by the side where the walkway's going, roughly to that small little tree. He defied orders of Henry Hunt, kept his guns open and fire with their anti-personnel ordnance, against people, personnel, that's canister rounds. And he kept up his fire, much to the chagrin of the infantry that was supposed to come up and take its place. While he's up there firing his guns, then infantry has to hold back until they pull his guns back. Alonzo Cushing stepped it up. He kept firing and firing and firing, defying Henry Hunt's orders. When one by one, he started losing men. When he was down to about one gun, as the Confederates were moving up the slope, he was down to one gun, and I think he had 2 other men helping him on that one gun fire. Finally, a bullet crashes through the air, crashes into his mouth, kills him, and finally, some infantry came up to slowly pull those guns back. But by then, the Confederates were really close to that stone wall up there. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Let's get up towards that stone. Well, now they're even more condensed. Just this side of the Bryan Farm. That fence line probably for the Kemper's men. They're just so packed together. And of course at the cyclorama, and you hear and different readings about Gettysburg, that as they neared the wall, the Confederates gave out their rebel yell, and they charged across the. No. That makes good stories, and it makes good legend. But there's no reports from Confederate commands or from the Federal Army that any rebel yell went up. The only thing that the Federals reported on is every time they fired either Cushing's guns with their canister or the infantry, he said all we heard from the Confederates was one big collective groan. But they pressed forward. They were directed, mixing in Pickett's men and, of course, Pettigrew's men at a very narrow point of attack, as you can see. And some of them reached the wall. And some of the men, they were just told, they weren't told what their goal. The goal is break through the wall or get to the wall. That's the only directions they had. Some of the men took that literally. With all the losses they left behind in the field, they got to the wall and they reached their objective. So one man said, I reached the wall, there's a Union soldier on the other side. He let his hand out, pulled me over the wall and said, come to this side of the Lord, and I would surrender. I did what I was asked to do. I reached the wall. Other men started putting up a fight here. They stopped, and now they're starting to fire their weapons and so forth. And because you got to break through somehow. And Alonzo Cushing, now killed right here, it has some infantry soldiers from around the area trying to pull his guns, and you can see his guns back here. There were a number of breakthroughs. If you go on this side of the angle of the stone wall, you see a little monument to the 26th North Carolina. Company A and some of the companies in 26th got deeper into the Federal line, but because it's an angle, they didn't break through the wall. But that's why the North Carolina troops always said, we went the farthest at Gettysburg over the Virginians. But right about this area, the angle where the stone wall goes down, after tremendous losses, the second wave of General Pickett's, which is Lewis Armistead, and he took some men from Pickett and Pettigrew's command. We reckon that maybe about 250 men saw the opportunity as the guns were pulling back from right here back to their position over there. There was no infantry here. So Lewis Armistead, with about 250 men, made their way over the wall and started to head towards those guns. They broke through the Federal line. Not in any great numbers, but they broke through. Now, General John Gibbon, who was actually the Second Corps, acting Second Corps commander, saw Lewis Armistead with 250 Confederates breaking through at the angle. The guns way back here, the infantry way back behind them, and knew that disaster could befall his Second Corps. He needed to get infantry up quickly to plug the gap. They should have been up there before, but since Alonzo Cushing, and he did a lot of damage on the Confederates firing his guns and defying Henry Hunt's orders, and eventually he's going to win the Medal of Honor for it, they left that gap. There's no infantry. It was a solid line of infantry except right here. And John Gibbon knew that the Confederates, if they break through, it's just a matter of time, but before their reserves come up, and it could spell disaster. So we quickly ordered this gentleman right over here, statue, Alexander Webb, and the Philadelphia Brigade. You Pennsylvanians know of them. He ordered them up immediately to plug this gap. Alexander Webb reacted immediately, and they ended up taking most of Lewis Armistead's men, was roughly 250 Confederates prisoners of war. Lewis Armistead wasn't as fortunate. He was mortally wounded. His monument is now near the closed area. You can see, oh, it's right over here to your right. And he was later taken back to the 11th Corps Hospital, the George Spangler Farm. I think you can still visit that on the weekends. It's owned by the Gettysburg Foundation. He's going to die a few days later. And most of the men of Lewis Armistead were taken prisoner of war. Some of the men, when talking with their captors, their federal captors, said something very interesting. They told their captors that about 30 feet from that stone wall, it was void of federal infantry, they turned around to look for the reinforcements that they knew were coming. And guess what they told their captors they saw? Nothing. Nothing but the dead and the dying. What happened to those two brigades whose only job it was stand over on Seminary Ridge, wait for orders to advance to support Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble? The key to victory in most frontal assaults, the reserves. Well, there's enough blame to go around, and certainly the Confederate command blames each other, but all I can say is that there was a logistical breakdown in communication, and those reserves never left their posts. They stood in battle formation, waiting for orders that never came, never to support Pickett's charge. One gentleman said a few weeks ago, he said, they wouldn't have made a difference anyway. Well, we'll never know. They were never called in. So you can be the judge in that. And about 45 minutes after it started, Longstreet's assault, Pickett's charge, Pickett-Pettigrew charge, the frontal assault against these Union lines was over. And we went through all the principles of the frontal assault, and one by one, from the point of attack right up through the reserves coming in, all 6 of them deserted General Lee that day. And it's interesting, on frontal assaults, if you're a commander that orders one and all those 6 principles are in play and everything goes according to plan, you're called brilliant, bold, determined commander. But if those same principles fail you, then you're called crazy, stupid, and insane. That comes, I guess, with the territory of a frontal assault. But I'd like to leave you with one more thing that I believe contributed to this frontal assault. And it does apply to most of these direct frontal assaults against opponent's line. And I like to call it's the 7th principle, an unofficial 7th principle. This 7th principle wasn't drilled into your head in the West Point classroom. It's what commanders usually remember from previous battles and previous frontal assaults that they take into account. And that 7th principle, unofficial principle, because it wasn't drilled into his head at West Point, slipped General Lee's mind, I'm in the opinion, for just a split second when formulating Pickett's charge. And I think this unofficial principle has just as much importance on a frontal assault than the 6 that were drilled into your head in a West Point classroom. That 7th principle is when soldiers are fighting on the land of their birth, defending their families, their farms, their loved ones, with their backs up against the wall, with no other place to go, men fight a lot longer. They fight a lot harder, and they fight with a common ferocity that seldom see in day-to-day combat. What General Lee slipped his mind for just a split second, that he'd been piling up great victories for almost 2 years now, fighting where? In Virginia. With what? With Virginians. fighting on Southern soil with Southern troops that were defending their families, their farms, their loved ones, their way of life, their backs right up against the wall. That here at Gettysburg, that scenario has been reversed. General Lee slips his mind just for a split second. Maybe that's all it took. That now it's flip-flopped. That these federal soldiers fighting on the land of their birth, defending their families, their farms, their loved ones with their backs up against the wall, aren't going to fight as hard as long as his men? Slips his mind for just a split second. And I think that's what basically, I think along, of course, with the other 6 that are drilled into your head, but the 7th unofficial principle contributed a lot, I believe, to this the defeat of this frontal assault. Years later, about a year before his death, General Pickett summed it all up. He was meeting with a group of veterans, old veterans, and of course they're getting together and they're talking about their families and their loved ones and what's going on in their day-to-day lives. And then, of course, as with all old veterans, their thoughts turn to the war, very important time of their lives. And when their thoughts turn to the war, they always turn to Gettysburg, if you're in the Army of Northern Virginia. And these men were discussing what cost our grand Confederate Army in Northern Virginia a great victory at Gettysburg. And the men, one by one, stood up and said, it was the weather. We were far from our supply base. We were fighting in the worst terrain we ever fought during the whole war, said the veterans over at Culp's Hill. And then they noticed General Pickett down at the end of the table, only about a year from death and very sick. They asked General Pickett if he would contribute what he thought led to the defeat at Gettysburg. General Pickett gets up in a very soft voice. He agrees with everything those men said, one by one. I wouldn't doubt it was the terrain. Certainly it was far from our supply base. The weather wasn't very conducive. But somehow when I look back, I can't help but think that the Federal Army had something to do with it. And that is that 7th principle that might have slipped General Lee's mind for just a split second that cost him this frontal assault. Well, I'd like to, I'll stay around here for a little bit. If you folks want to catch your breath a little bit and then go back over the other side. But I'd like to thank you folks for coming along this morning and allowing me to share some of the Pickett's charge, frontal assault with you, Longstreet's assault with you. And thanks for your support in the Park Service and what we try to do. Years ago when I first came here, I was told by an old supervisor that I had, he said, your job is to speak for those that can't. And so tell their story accurately and do these men proud. And I never forgot that. So hopefully I accomplished that this morning with you. So thank you for supporting the Park Service, what we try to do. And also, I'd like to thank you folks for supporting the Park Service April 15th. Through that support, you've provided me for the last 38 years with one of the best jobs in these United States, and I'd like to thank you all for it. Thank you.